In 2014, ARI received approval on their larger sizes, 1.25" through 2. You saw the 3/4 and half through 1 inch already. So let's take a look at the larger sizes that are now have their approvals. They make a double check model DC 500, double check version, and an RP model RP 500, relief valve on the RP version. The double check has a similar body, blanked off for the bottom, so they look the same, similar up here from the top, but obviously you can see the difference. Anyway, the check mechanism, the double check are the same in the RP, so let's go ahead and take the RP apart and take a look and see what it has. First of all, on the top, you will notice there are 8 of the self-tapping screws, similar to the ones we saw in the small version. So once we get these last screws off, there will be spring tension from the relief valve spring underneath the cover. So hang on to with those last 2 on the side so that it does not cock to the side and break off a piece, damage any of it. Keep it coming straight like that. 2 remaining screws, I should say. Cover is going to come off next, and cover comes off, relief valve stem and relief valve spring. Now, what we're going to see inside is where that relief valve stem stood in the middle, similar to we saw in 3/4 and 1 inch. We're going to see a retainer. Move this to the side for a minute. Retainer that sits here that holds the 2 check assemblies in there. Now, this is obviously on a bench and on an open ball valve, but if this was installed in a plumbing system, you'd want to make sure test cocks 2 and 4 are open at this point, because as you try to pull the modular checks out of the body, you would have a vacuum created on the back side that was closed, and you'd actually break parts in there. Anyway, so when it's valves are shut off and you open all the 4 test cocks, leave them open before when you go to disassemble it. Now, I want to remove the retainer. It's the part between the 2 checks that holds the checks into the body. Pulls out from the top like this. Once I have the retainer out of the body, you can see the 2 checks. First check here, second check there. Small little screwdriver, little access over here. Allows you to slowly move that check assembly out, again with the number 2 and 4 test cock open as we mentioned. Check assembly 1, same with the second check over here. Small little screwdriver, get the O-ring moving, and second check comes out next. So for the body, here's my high pressure sensing line coming through here, which is coming through the cover right there. So there's my high pressure sensing line comes in, and check valves are in the body between the retainer. So let's go ahead and relief valve seat underneath the body. All right, let's put this on the side for a minute and look at the checks. So what you're going to see if the body was a cutaway, you would see the 2 checks like this. First check, second check. Relief valve spring sits on top of the retainer. Relief valve stem goes through that spring all the way down to the relief valve seat, and relief valve cover will be sitting on top. So that's what it looks like outside of the body. Let's go ahead and take the check assemblies apart first. First check, retainer. Checks are sealed by an O-ring. Very important for proper lubrication of the O-ring for it to work properly. Old O-ring comes off. Now to disassemble the 2 checks, you want to have a firm grip, something like a jar holder, something like that. And you're going to rotate it 1/8 of a turn. Once you rotate that, you're going to have your spring retainer, your spring, your disc holder and disc, and your seat. 1 screw holds the disc into the disc holder. Replace the disc. Reassembly is going to be the reverse. Back together. That has kind of sharp corners on the end. That's another reason it helps to have something to hold it when you go to put it back together. Like that. And like that. Reinstall the O-ring, proper lubrication O-ring like all O-rings. As you wipe the grease in your fingers, wipe it all the way around 360 degrees. Then stretching it over the check assembly like that. Ready to go back into the body. Now let's look at the relief valve. Relief valve stem in 1 piece. 2 Phillip head screws, 1 on the top side, 1 on the lower side holds the disc, this one holds the diaphragm. And stem O-ring on the top. Function of that O-ring is just as a guide. It slides in and out of the cover like this. While you're looking at the cover, you'll notice there is a hole drilled in the center of that cover right there. It's a breather hole. In other words, this sits in the body like that. High pressure sensing line comes through this sensing line, puts the high pressure on top of the elastic element, closing the relief valve. Low pressure comes underneath from the body itself. This O-ring acts as a guide inside the cover, as I say, and moves up and down. So the top part of that O-ring is open to atmosphere. From the O-ring to the diaphragm is your high pressure sensing line, like this. So this O-ring is important because as the stem moves up and down, that air has to displace somewhere. And so as it moves up and down, this is a breather hole, which allows that stem to move up and down and pushing air in and out of that breather hole. So make sure the breather hole is open, and also if the breather hole has water leaking out of it, you know it's leaking from that O-ring. Anyway, back to this, get the relief valve stem apart. We have one screw, our upper diaphragm retainer and O-ring, diaphragm, stem assembly. On the bottom side we have one screw that holds the relief valve disc in place. Go ahead and remove that screw also. Guide, screw, and relief valve disc, which is not symmetrical, has a lip on one side, and those are the parts of the relief valve. Reassembly is going to be the reverse, the relief valve disc, guide, our assembly screw. There is not an O-ring assistance on that, so we want to make sure it's very tight. A gasket seal, as we've said. Now, on the diaphragm, you'll notice that there is an O-ring molded on the inside and the outside, and there's a slot right here inside on that stem assembly. So it has to go this way. If you put the diaphragm on that way, the slot will not seal, and also the slot inside the body that you see right here. So the diaphragm has to go in that slot, like this, and in the O-ring slot right here. So double check it to make sure it's in correctly. Like that. Stem on top. Our, oops. On top, just like that. Tighten our diaphragm screw, and again, we want to make sure that it's very tight, because we're facilitating a water seal across that diaphragm with the screws, so it has to hold through here. You'll notice that the diaphragm, the plate up here is a little loose so that the diaphragm can move through its normal travel. Now, ready to put it all back together. I'm going to put the check assemblies in first. Second check in first, getting it all the way back into the body. It's important that we have it in, because otherwise the retainer won't go in. First check goes in second. Again, making sure the O-rings are, the test cocks are still open in an installed assembly, because we have to get the check assembly in there and there. So we got the check assemblies all the way through the body so that they're in the slots. Now we take the retainer. You'll notice on this one end of the retainer that there is a cut edge here and a solid edge here. This cut edge goes towards the first check. And it's there for a couple reasons. One main reason is that if that first check stem assembly, which travels in and out like this, was stuck, say it had a rock or something in the first check, that stem would protrude back across this retainer. And as you came to put the retainer up, if it was a solid piece like this, you couldn't pull it up. But by having that slot, if they had a bad first check leak and that stem was sticking back, the retainer can still come out for an average repair. So normally the stem will be sitting here, but if there's a rock or something holding it open and the stems and the first check's held open, this little notch in the retainer allows you to pull that out. Now we want to install the retainer back in. Again, that's the first check side. We want to put it back in, make sure it goes. If it doesn't go, we know we don't have the check assemblies all the way in. And if it goes in easily like that, you know you do. You want to push it down hard. You want to hear a little clicking sound like that. That way you know you're at the bottom and it's in. Because once it's in, it is tight. You'll notice that there's very small movement of that once it's in. It's very important to get that in, get that clicking sound. Push it down with a little bit of force, and you'll actually hear that click, which makes you know that that retainer is in properly. Relief valve spring, relief valve stem. Now for a little delicate balance, we want to make sure we hit the center of that relief valve seat. In other words, that stem has to come right through the center, just like that. And it's not, with this guide, it's usually easy to do it, but you don't want to be bouncing it around there because you can damage that seat if you just keep pushing down from the top. So get spring, our relief valve stem ready. Now we want to get our cover. So I want to go ahead and mount that into the cover like that, having it ready, because that's going to help me center that stem. In other words, by lining up these bolt holes at this point, it's going to help me make sure I hit the center of that relief valve seat, which makes sure I hit the center of that seat without the guide, without damaging it. So what I want to do is line up my bolt holes and gently push down until I have it firmly down. Then go ahead, tighten my screws. Again, it's sealing by an O-ring on that diaphragm, but you still want to tighten everything evenly as you go across it, because you are dealing with plastic and you don't want to have any excessive stress on one side or the other. Go ahead and put all the other screws in, tighten it up, and that's what the 1¼ through 2" model RP500 ARI looks like. It's actually a plastic body. The ball valves are low lead so that it's an unleaded backflow assembly to meet the requirements of the no lead requirements. And that's our ARI in the larger sizes.